In the quiet coastal town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, a group of angry teenagers was about to face consequences they never imagined. What started as a late-night dare took a shocking turn when they came face to face with the full weight of military honor. Jake Morrison wasn't your typical troubled teen. For 5 years, he had spent his life running from his father's legacy, known for his intelligence and natural leadership, both of which he'd been using destructively. When they encountered the World War II memorial that night, spray paint cans in hand, they had no idea they were desecrating sacred ground. Jake's act of vandalism would lead to an unprecedented response that challenged everything he believed about sacrifice. What began as mindless destruction would become profound healing. The town would never be the same after 200 Marines arrived, with quiet dignity, showing what it truly means to honor the fallen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humid May air clung to Jake Morrison's skin like guilt he hadn't earned yet. 3 days before Memorial Day weekend, Millbrook's streets stretched empty under the yellow glow of streetlights, the kind of small-town quiet that made 17-year-olds feel like they were suffocating. Jake kicked at a loose piece of asphalt, his worn sneakers scuffing against the pavement as Tommy Chen and Casey Williams flanked him on either side. "This place is a graveyard," Jake muttered, his voice carrying the particular brand of disgust that only teenagers could perfect. "Nothing ever happens here. Nothing ever changes." Tommy adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit that had followed him since middle school. "Come on, man, it's not that bad. At least we graduate in 2 weeks." His voice carried the careful optimism of someone who'd spent years trying to keep peace between conflicting worlds, his parents' expectations and his friends' restless anger. Casey snorted, her boots clicking against the sidewalk with deliberate aggression. At 18, she'd already aged out of the foster system, working part-time at the grocery store while finishing high school a year behind her peers. Graduate. To what? Stay here and work at the cannery? Leave for college and come back broke? She pulled her denim jacket tighter, though the night was warm. Same difference. Jake's jaw tightened. The familiar anger stirred in his chest, the kind that had been his companion since he was 12 years old, since the knock on the door that changed everything, since his mother stopped talking about his father except in whispers with bill collectors, who wanted to know why military death benefits weren't enough to cover rent. "At least your mom gives a damn about college," Jake said, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Mine's too busy working double shifts to pretend I matter." Tommy flinched. He'd known Jake since elementary school, had watched his friend transform, from the kid who built elaborate Lego fortresses into someone who seemed determined to tear everything down. "She cares, Jake. She's just what?" Jake wheeled on him, his green eyes blazing under the streetlight. "Just working herself to death because my old man decided playing soldier was more important than staying alive for his family?" The words hung in the humid air like smoke. Casey watched the exchange with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned early that other people's pain could be either weapon or shield. Tommy's face crumpled with the weight of words he couldn't take back or make right. They'd reached Veterans Park without really meaning to, their aimless wandering guided by the invisible currents that pulled restless teenagers toward trouble. The memorial stood in the center of the small park, a granite monument that caught the orange glow of the nearby streetlights. Bronze plaques lined its base, names etched in careful rows, local sons who died in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and more recent conflicts that the town preferred not to think about too closely. Jake stopped walking, his eyes fixed on the memorial with the intensity of someone staring at an old enemy. "Look at this thing," he said, his voice dropping to something softer and more dangerous. "All these names. All these guys who died for nothing." Jake, Tommy's voice carried a warning, but it was the kind of warning that came too late, after the avalanche had already started. No, seriously. Jake stepped closer to the monument, his hands clenched at his sides. What did any of it matter? Korea? Vietnam? Afghanistan? His voice cracked on the last word, revealing the raw wound beneath his anger. They're all dead. Their families are all broken. And for what? Casey moved closer, sensing opportunity the way predators sense weakness. You're right, she said, her voice carrying a challenge. It's all bullshit, pretty words carved in stone to make people feel better about sending kids off to die. Tommy looked between his friends, recognizing the moment when conversation shifted into something else entirely. His grandparents had fled Vietnam in a boat with nothing but the clothes on their backs. His parents spoke of sacrifice and honor with the reverence of people who understood the cost of freedom. But here, now, with Jake's pain radiating like heat and Casey's anger feeding off it, those lessons felt distant and abstract. My dad used to say... Jake's voice broke, then hardened again. He used to say he was serving something bigger than himself, protecting freedom, making the world safe. Jake laughed, but it sounded more like breaking glass. Safe for what? So his son could grow up without a father? So his wife could work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on? Casey pulled a can of spray paint from her jacket pocket. Red paint she'd lifted from her job at the hardware store, originally intended for some vague act of rebellion she hadn't yet defined. You want to make a statement about what you think of their precious heroes. The challenge hung between them like a dare, like a door opening onto something none of them could take back. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. Casey, we can't. Can't what? Her eyes glittered with malicious excitement. Leave your mark, Jake. Show them what you really think about their war heroes. Jake stared at the spray paint can, his reflection distorted in its metallic surface. Every rational part of his mind screamed warnings, but rational thought had been losing ground to rage for years now. The memorial stood before him like everything he'd learned to hate, empty symbols, hollow promises, pretty lies carved in stone while real families fell apart in real homes. Jake, man, this isn't you, Tommy whispered. But even he could hear how unconvincing he sounded. This was exactly who Jake had become, maybe who he'd always been since that morning, when 2 uniformed officers stood on his front porch with their careful words and practiced sympathy. Jake took the spray paint can. Its weight felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained more than just paint and pressure. Maybe it's time someone told the truth about this place. The first spray of paint across the granite felt like breaking a dam. Red paint streaked across the memorial's face, covering names and dates with crude symbols and hasty words. Died for nothing appeared in jagged letters. A rough peace sign covered part of the dedication plaque. Casey cheered him on, adding, her own marks, symbols of rebellion that felt powerful in the moment, but would look like vandalism in the morning light. Tommy stood frozen, watching his friend destroy something the entire town held sacred. His phone buzzed with a text from his parents asking when he'd be home. The normalcy of it, the assumption that he was still the good kid they thought they knew, made his stomach twist with guilt and complicity. The vandalism took less than 10 minutes. When they finished, the memorial looked like a casualty of war itself, defaced, degraded, transformed from monument to target. Jake stepped back, breathing hard, the spray paint can dangling from his fingers like evidence. Jesus, Tommy whispered, staring at what they'd done. Jesus Christ, Jake. But Jake wasn't looking at the memorial anymore. He was staring at his hands, at the red paint under his fingernails, as if seeing them for the first time. The rage that had carried him through the act was already fading, leaving behind something colder and more frightening. The realization that there was no taking this back. Casey laughed, high and sharp, but there was something desperate in the sound. Come on, she said, grabbing Jake's arm. We need to get out of here. They ran then, their footsteps echoing off empty storefronts and sleeping houses. Behind them, the memorial stood violated and exposed under the streetlights, waiting for dawn and discovery. Margaret Sullivan found it at sunrise during her daily walk, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she stared at the desecration. At 83, she'd seen enough of loss and healing to recognize the difference between malice and pain. But recognition didn't make the sight any less devastating. She called the police first, then the VFW post, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. By the time the sun fully rose over Millbrook, the news was spreading through the tight-knit community like wildfire through dry grass. The security camera at the bank across the street had captured everything. The security camera footage left no room for doubt. By 10 o'clock Saturday morning, Jake Morrison's face was being shared across Millbrook's social media feeds, his name whispered in grocery store aisles and coffee shop lines with the kind of scandalized outrage that small towns perfected. But 300 miles south at Camp Lejeune, Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez stared at her computer screen with a recognition that cut deeper than community gossip. She'd been scrolling through her morning news feed when the headline caught her attention: "Local Memorial Vandalized by Teenagers." The accompanying photo showed red paint streaked across granite, crude symbols covering bronze plaques. Typical weekend vandalism, the kind of story she usually scrolled past. But then she saw the name in the article: Jake Morrison, 17, identified as the ringleader, Morrison. The name hit her like a physical blow, dragging her back 5 years to a dusty Afghan hillside where Staff Sergeant David Morrison had thrown himself between her and a grenade, saving her life, and 3 other Marines at the cost of his own. Rodriguez's hands trembled as she pulled up Jake's school photo from the news article. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same dark hair, the same stubborn jawline, the same green eyes. But where David's eyes had held warmth and determination, his son's carried an anger that Rodriguez recognized from her own mirror in the months after the funeral. She stood from her desk, muscle memory carrying her to the filing cabinet where she kept her personal records. David Morrison's service folder was thick with commendations and personal letters. But Rodriguez flipped past the official documents to her own handwritten account of his final day. Details she'd shared with no one, not even the chaplain who'd helped her process the survivor's guilt. "He saved 4 Marines that day," she said aloud to the empty office. "Talked about his boy constantly. Jake. Said he was smart as hell, but stubborn as a mule." The irony cut deep. David Morrison had died protecting strangers, and now his son was desecrating memorials to the fallen. But Rodriguez had spent 15 years learning to read between the lines of human behavior. The worst actions often came from the deepest wounds, and Jake Morrison's anger looked suspiciously like grief with nowhere to go. She reached for her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found Corporal Michael Torres. If anyone would understand what she was thinking, it would be Torres, an Iraq veteran who'd lost his legs to an IED but had transformed his recovery into a mission serving other wounded warriors. "Rodriguez," Torres answered, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of Marines who'd shared too many difficult conversations to waste time on formalities. "Mike, I need to run something by you, and it's going to sound crazy," she explained quickly. The vandalism, the connection to David Morrison, the idea forming in her mind like a military operation taking shape. Torres listened without interruption, the silence punctuated only by the distant sounds of his Saturday morning routine. "You want to organize a restoration mission," he said finally, understanding immediately. "Not punishment. Restoration. David Morrison saved my life. His kid is hurting, acting out because he doesn't understand what his father died for. Maybe if we showed him what honor looks like when it responds to disrespect." "How many Marines you thinking?" Rodriguez felt something settle in her chest, the calm that came when a mission felt right. As many as want to volunteer, full dress blues. We go up there, we restore that memorial, and we do it the right way. When? Today, this afternoon, before that damage sits there another night. Torres was quiet for a moment, considering. Implications. You know, the chain of command is going to have questions. I know what David Morrison's son needs to see. That's what matters. Within 90 minutes, Rodriguez had organized something that would have impressed her drill instructors. Word spread through Camp Lejeune with the efficiency of Marines who understood that some missions transcended official channels. They came from everywhere. Infantry Marines finishing weekend duty, mechanics with grease still under their fingernails, administrative clerks who rarely left their offices, staff sergeants who should have been home with their families. They gathered in the motor pool parking lot. 200 Marines in dress blue uniforms, hastily retrieved from barracks closets and dry cleaners. Rodriguez had secured transportation through a combination of official request and personal favors, military. Buses that would make their arrival look like an official operation, even though every Marine was there as a volunteer. Lieutenant David Park had been among the first to sign up. Fresh from officer candidate school at 23, he was young enough to remember what teenage anger felt like, old enough to recognize it as something more complex than simple rebellion. His younger siblings were still in high school back in California, and something about Jake Morrison's story had hit him in a place he didn't want to examine too closely. As the buses loaded, Rodriguez moved through the ranks, checking uniforms, and answering the questions that came with any unusual mission. The Marines understood they were heading into uncertain territory, a civilian community that might not welcome their presence, a situation with no clear precedent in military protocol. "What exactly are we doing when we get there, Sergeant?" asked Lance Corporal Williams, a young Marine from Rodriguez's unit, who'd never been involved in anything quite like this. "We're going to restore that memorial," Rodriguez replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned her respect across 3 deployments. "We're going to show that community what honor looks like when it responds to disrespect." The 3-hour drive to Millbrook passed in contemplative quiet. 200 Marines, lost in thoughts about duty and service and the strange mission they'd volunteered for. Some dozed against windows, others stared out at passing farmland. A few checked phones to follow the growing news coverage of the vandalism story. They arrived as the afternoon sun began slanting low through the trees surrounding Veterans Park. The buses pulled up in perfect formation, their synchronized arrival announced by diesel engines and the measured sound of Marines disembarking in coordinated waves. The effect on Millbrook was immediate and electric. People emerged from shops and houses, drawn by the sight of military buses and the sea of dress blue uniforms. Phones appeared, recording as 200 Marines formed precise ranks in the park's open space, their movements coordinated with precision that spoke to years of training and shared purpose. Rodriguez called the formation to attention, her voice carrying across the gathering crowd with command authority. The Marines snapped to position as one, their bearings straight and proud, despite curious stares from townspeople who had never seen anything like this in their quiet coastal community. Then, without fanfare or lengthy explanation, they began to work. They had brought cleaning supplies, restoration materials, tools for careful repair work. Where the vandalism had been hasty and angry, the Marines approached their task with methodical care. They cleaned each defaced name with reverent attention, removed paint with chemicals that wouldn't damage the stone, polished brass plaques until they gleamed in the afternoon sun. Mayor Patricia Williams arrived to find her town square transformed into something resembling a military ceremony. She parked and walked toward the memorial, trying to process the sight of 200 Marines working in coordinated silence to repair damage done by local teenagers she'd known since they were children. 3 blocks away, Jake Morrison pressed, his face to his bedroom window, watching strangers in uniform carefully restore what he had destroyed in anger. His mother was at work, unaware that her son's crime had attracted the attention of the entire U.S. Marine Corps. For the first time since holding that spray paint can, Jake began to understand that actions had consequences extending far beyond anything he'd imagined. The restoration continued as afternoon shadows lengthened, precise and purposeful, while news crews arrived and the story began spreading beyond Millbrook's borders. But Rodriguez paid no attention to cameras or growing crowds. Her focus remained on the memorial and the names etched there, including David Morrison, who had died saving her life, whose son was learning his first hard lesson about what happened when strangers chose honor over revenge. The restoration continued as afternoon shadows lengthened, precise and purposeful, while news crews arrived and the story began spreading beyond Millbrook's borders. But Rodriguez paid no attention to cameras or growing crowds. Her focus remained on the memorial and the names etched there, including David Morrison, who had died saving her life, whose son was learning his first hard lesson about what happened when strangers chose honor over revenge. By 9 o'clock that evening, most of the Marines had returned to their buses, their work complete. The memorial stood restored, its granite surface clean and gleaming under the park's floodlights. But Rodriguez remained, having dismissed her unit with orders to return to base while she stayed behind to stand vigil. She told Lieutenant Park she needed to finish some final details, but the truth was more complicated. She needed to be here when Jake Morrison finally found the courage to face what he'd done. She didn't have to wait long. Jake emerged from the darkness at the edge of the park just after 10, his movements hesitant but determined. He'd spent hours watching from his window as Marines methodically undid his destruction, each careful stroke of their cleaning rags feeling like judgment against his soul. His mother had returned from work exhausted and unaware, falling asleep on the couch while local news played footage of the restoration. Jake had slipped out through his bedroom window, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name. Rodriguez spotted him immediately, the careful way he moved through shadows, the hunched shoulders of someone carrying weight too heavy for 17 years. She remained motionless beside the memorial, her dress blue uniform making her a visible presence in the pools of artificial light. "I know you're there," she called softly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made hiding pointless. "You might as well come over." Jake froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but something in her tone, not anger, not judgment, just tired patience, kept his feet planted. He stepped into the light, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground. "You're him," Rodriguez said, and it wasn't a question. "Jake Morrison." He nodded, still not looking up. Up close, the resemblance to his father was even more striking. The same stubborn set to his jaw, the same way of holding tension in his shoulders when cornered. "I'm Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez," she continued, studying his face as recognition flickered in his eyes. "I served with your father in Afghanistan. I was there when he died." Jake's head snapped up, his green eyes wide with something between hunger and fear. "You knew him?" "I knew him." Rodriguez moved closer, her voice gentling. "He talked about you constantly, carried your picture in his helmet, said you were the smartest kid he'd ever met, but stubborn as hell when you got an idea in your head." Jake's composure cracked slightly. "He left," he said, the words coming out harsh and defensive. "He chose to leave us and play soldier in some desert on the other side of the world." "Is that what you think?" Rodriguez stepped closer to the memorial, her hand tracing one of the bronze plaques. "Come here, Jake. There's something you need to see." He followed reluctantly, his feet heavy as concrete. Rodriguez guided him to the far side of the memorial, to a section that had been hidden from his bedroom window. There, etched in careful letters among rows of other names, was Staff Sergeant David A. Morrison, Afghanistan, 2019. Jake stared at the name as if seeing a ghost. His legs went weak, and he sank onto the memorial's stone bench, his face pale under the floodlights. "You never looked, did you?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "You never came here to see his name?" "I couldn't." The admission came out broken, 5 years of suppressed grief cracking through his anger. "Mom wanted to right after, but I couldn't. I didn't want to see it, didn't want it to be real." Rodriguez sat beside him on the bench, her formal military bearing softening into something more human. "Tell me what you remember about that day, when they came to tell you." Jake's hands trembled as he pressed them against his knees. 2 Marines in dress uniforms, just like yours. They stood on our porch and said he was gone. Mom collapsed. I had to catch her. I was 12 years old, and I had to catch my mother while strangers told us my dad was dead. And you've been angry ever since. Wouldn't you be? Jake's voice rose, then cracked. He chose them over us, chose submission over staying alive for his family. What kind of father does that? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, watching Jake's face in the shifting light. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of witness. The kind who throws himself on a grenade to save 4 Marines he's never going to see grow up. The kind who dies so that other people's children get to come home. Jake's breath caught. "What?" "Your father saved my life, Jake. And 3 other Marines. We were pinned down, taking fire from a position we couldn't reach. Someone threw a grenade into our foxhole. Your father didn't hesitate. He covered it with his body." Rodriguez's voice stayed steady, but her hands clenched in her lap. "I watched him die. I held his hand while he died. You want to know what his last words were?" Jake couldn't speak, tears streaming down his face. He said, "Tell Jake I'm sorry. Tell him I love him. Tell him this mattered." Rodriguez turned to face him fully. "I've carried that message for 5 years, waiting for the right time to deliver it, waiting for you to be ready to hear it." The sound that came from Jake was part sob, part scream. 5 years of buried grief, finally breaking free. He doubled over on the bench, his body shaking with the force of emotions he'd refused to feel. Rodriguez didn't try to comfort him with words. She simply sat beside him in the memorial's shadow, letting him cry for the father he'd lost, and the anger he'd carried, and the weight of understanding that was settling on his shoulders, like a uniform he wasn't ready to wear. From the edge of the park, Tommy Chen watched his friend's breakdown with wide eyes. He'd followed Jake, worried about what his friend might do in his current state of mind. Now he stood frozen, witnessing something too private and profound for casual observation. Behind him, Margaret Sullivan emerged from her evening walk, having been drawn by the sound of Jake's crying. She took in the scene with the sharp eyes of someone who'd witnessed enough grief to recognize its stages, and quietly settled on a distant bench to keep watch. Not intruding, but present in case her help was needed. The memorial stood silent. Around them, its restored surface reflecting the nightlights like a mirror of memory and sacrifice. Jake Morrison sat beside the woman who'd held his father's hand as he died, finally understanding that some choices aren't about abandonment. They're about love too large to be contained by the people who receive it. Jake Morrison sat beside the woman who'd held his father's hand as he died, finally understanding that some choices aren't about abandonment. They're about love too large to be contained by the people who receive it. The tears had stopped, leaving behind a raw emptiness that felt almost like relief. For the first time in 5 years, the anger wasn't consuming him from the inside, but Sunday morning brought reality crashing back with the force of a rip current. Casey Williams arrived at the memorial just after 10 o'clock, her boots clicking against the sidewalk with deliberate aggression. She'd spent Saturday night scrolling through social media, watching videos of Marines restoring what they'd destroyed, reading comments that ranged from sympathy to outrage. The attention made her skin crawl. She didn't want pity, and she sure as hell didn't want to be saved. Jake was already there, sitting on the memorial bench with a stillness that looked foreign on him. Tommy stood nearby, shifting his weight from foot to foot in that nervous way that meant he was caught between competing loyalties. The memorial gleamed in the morning sun, every trace of their vandalism erased by careful hands. "Well, well," Casey said, her voice carrying the sharp edge she'd perfected over years of foster homes and failed placements. "Look who decided to have a come-to-Jesus moment." Jake looked up, and Casey was startled by what she saw in his face. The anger that had always defined him was still there, but muted, complicated by something that looked suspiciously like grief. "Casey," he said quietly, "we need to talk about what we did." "What we did?" Casey laughed, but it sounded more like breaking glass. "You mean what you did? This was your idea, your little tantrum about daddy issues." Tommy flinched at the cruelty in her voice. "Casey, that's not fair." "Fair?" She wheeled on him, her eyes blazing. "You want to talk about fair? Fair is not having Marines show up to clean up our mess like we're some charity case. Fair is not having the whole town talking about us like we're broken toys that need fixing." Lieutenant David Park had been approaching the memorial with a small group of Marines who'd volunteered to stay behind for additional restoration work. He paused when he heard voices rising in conflict, recognizing the sharp tone of people in pain, lashing out at each other. Casey spotted the Marines, and her voice jumped an octave. "Perfect. Here come the heroes again." She strode toward Park, with the kind of aggressive confidence that usually made adults back down. "You here to save some more souls? Fix some more broken teenagers?" Park held his ground, his training keeping his expression neutral despite Casey's obvious hostility. At 23, he was young enough to remember what it felt like to be angry at the world, old enough to recognize defensive posturing when he saw it. "We're here to finish the restoration work," he said calmly, "and to pay our respects." "Bullshit." Casey stepped closer, invading his personal space in a way designed to provoke. "You're here because it makes you feel good, makes you feel like heroes saving the poor, misguided kids who don't understand sacrifice." Jake stood up from the bench, something in Casey's tone triggering an alarm he couldn't ignore. "Casey, stop! Stop what?" She turned on him, her pain transmuting into rage with the ease of long practice. "Stop telling the truth. Stop pointing out that your new Marine friends are just here to make themselves feel better about whatever guilt they're carrying." "They're here because my father saved their lives," Jake said, his voice carrying a certainty that hadn't been there the day before. "They're here because they understand what honor means." Casey stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. "Jesus Christ, Jake. They really got to you, didn't they? One sob story about your dead dad and you're ready to join up?" The words hit Jake like a physical blow, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Corporal Michael Torres rolled his wheelchair closer to the group, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. He wore his dress blues despite the warm morning, his bearing carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from surviving the worst life could throw at him. Casey's eyes fixed on the wheelchair, her expression shifting through several emotions before settling on something that looked like disgust. "Oh, perfect. Now they're bringing out the inspiration porn." The silence that followed was absolute. Tommy's face went white. Jake stepped backward as if Casey had slapped him. Even Park, trained in military discipline, struggled to keep his expression neutral. Torres rolled closer, his dark eyes never leaving Casey's face. "You know what I think?" he said conversationally. "I think you're scared." "I'm not scared of anything," Casey shot back, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "No?" Torres tilted his head slightly. "You're not scared." That maybe, just maybe, there are people in this world who choose to serve something bigger than themselves. You're not scared that maybe your anger isn't as righteous as you think it is. Casey's hands clenched into fists. You don't know anything about me. I know you're 18 years old and angry at everyone who's ever left you behind, Torres said, his voice gentle despite the brutal accuracy of his words. I know you think strength means never letting anyone close enough to hurt you. I know you're standing here insulting a disabled veteran because you think it'll make us all go away and leave you alone with your pain. Shut up. Casey's voice cracked on the words. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I lost my legs to an IED in Fallujah. Torres continued, his tone conversational. Woke up in a hospital in Germany, missing everything below the knee. You'd know what my first thought was? That I was useless, that I'd never be worth anything to anyone ever again. Casey's aggressive stance began to waver. But you know what I learned? Strength isn't about never getting hurt. It's about what you do after you get hurt. It's about whether you let your pain make you smaller or whether you use it to understand other people's pain. From the edge of the group, Frank Kowalski stepped forward. The Vietnam veteran had been watching the confrontation with the careful attention of someone who recognized the signs of a soul in crisis. I know that kind of anger, he said quietly, his gravelly voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. Carried it for 40 years after I came back from Nam, nearly destroyed me. Casey looked between Torres and Kowalski, her defenses finally beginning to crack. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to have everyone leave. Kid, Frank said, his voice infinitely sad, I've been alone for 40 years because I was too angry to let anyone stay. Don't make my mistakes. Casey's face crumpled, the tough facade finally giving way to the frightened 18-year-old underneath. But before anyone could respond, Mayor Patricia Williams stepped out of her car at the edge of the park, her expression grim with political calculation and family obligation. The confrontation was about to get much more complicated. Casey's face crumpled, the tough facade finally giving way to the frightened 18-year-old underneath. But before anyone could respond, Mayor Patricia Williams stepped out of her car. At the edge of the park, her expression grim with political calculation and family obligation. The confrontation was about to get much more complicated. Patricia Williams had spent Sunday morning fielding phone calls from town council members, local business owners, and concerned citizens who wanted to know why Marines were still occupying Veterans Park and why the vandals weren't in jail. She'd driven to the memorial expecting to find a manageable situation, not an emotional breakdown involving her estranged niece and half the Marine Corps. Casey, she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate family drama through political channels. I think we need to talk. Casey's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face hardening instantly. Aunt Patricia, come to make sure the family embarrassment doesn't reflect badly on your political career. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Patricia Williams had indeed spent the morning calculating how Casey's involvement in the vandalism would affect her upcoming re-election campaign. But standing here now, watching her sister's daughter fall apart in front of strangers, she felt something shift inside her chest. I came because you're family, Patricia said, the words coming out more honest than she'd intended. Because I should have been there for you years ago, and I wasn't. Tommy Chen had been watching the confrontation with growing unease, his academic mind trying to process the complex emotional dynamics playing out in front of him. His parents had raised him to respect authority, to honor sacrifice, to understand that freedom came with costs, but they'd also taught him that loyalty meant standing by your friends, even when they were making mistakes. Lieutenant Park noticed Tommy's internal struggle and moved closer, recognizing something familiar in the young man's careful posture and anxious expression. "You're Tommy," Park said, his voice carrying easy familiarity despite their having never met. "Jake's friend." Tommy nodded, adjusting his glasses in the nervous gesture that had followed him since middle school. "Yes, sir." "My parents immigrated from South Korea," Park continued conversationally. "They used to tell me stories about the war there, about American soldiers who died protecting people they'd never met. Always wondered if I'd have that kind of courage." Tommy's eyes widened slightly. His own grandparents had fled Vietnam in overcrowded boats, carrying nothing but hope and the determination to build something better for their children. His parents spoke of American military sacrifice with the reverence of people who understood its cost. "My family," Tommy began, then stopped, glancing toward Jake and Casey. "My grandparents came here as refugees from Vietnam." "That must have been difficult for them," Park said, his tone encouraging rather than probing. "My grandmother used to say that freedom isn't free," Tommy continued, the words coming easier now, "that someone always pays the price, and we should remember who paid it." He looked toward the memorial, its restored surface gleaming in the morning sun. "I knew it was wrong when we did it. I knew it, but I didn't stop it." Meanwhile, Frank Kowalski had approached Casey with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to recognize the signs of a person on the edge of emotional collapse. His own experience with anger and isolation had taught him when to push and when to simply be present. "You work at Morrison's Hardware, don't you?" he asked, his gravelly voice gentle despite years of cigarettes and whiskey. Casey wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to reassemble her defensive walls. "Part-time, after school. Thought I recognized you. I come in sometimes for supplies." Frank settled onto a nearby bench, his movements careful and deliberate. "Been meaning to ask someone there about paint removal. Got some old graffiti on my garage I've been meaning to deal with." Despite herself, Casey found her attention caught by the mundane normalcy of the conversation. "What kind of surface?" "Wood siding, old stuff, probably painted over a dozen times." "Chemical stripper," Casey said automatically. Her work experience, overriding her emotional turmoil, "but you'll need to be careful with the layers underneath. Probably got lead paint in there somewhere." Frank nodded seriously, as if this were the most important conversation of his day. "You know a lot about paint." "Foster homes teach you to fix things," Casey said, then stopped, surprised by her own honesty. "Always having to clean up messes. Patch holes, make things look normal for the next inspection." "That's a useful skill," Frank said without judgment, "understanding how to repair damage." The simplicity of his words hit Casey unexpectedly hard. She looked around the memorial, taking in the Marines who continued their restoration work with quiet efficiency, the gleaming bronze plaques that had been carefully cleaned of her angry symbols. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice small. "Maybe fixing isn't the right word," Frank suggested. "Maybe it's more about understanding what you broke and why it mattered to other people." Margaret Sullivan had been watching the various conversations unfold from her position near the memorial's central monument. At 83, she'd witnessed enough of human nature to recognize the moments when hearts began to open and walls began to come down. She approached Jake, who had been standing apart from the others, still processing his conversation with Master Sergeant Rodriguez from the night before. "I was here when they dedicated this memorial," she said without preamble, her sharp eyes studying his face. 1952. I was 23 years old, newly married, wearing a blue dress I'd saved for months to buy. Jake looked at her with surprise. He'd known Margaret Sullivan his entire life as the old woman who walked through town every morning, but he'd never really seen her as someone with her own history. "My husband had just come back from Korea," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades. He was different when he returned, quieter, had nightmares. But he was alive, and I was grateful every day for that. She gestured toward the memorial, its surface now reflecting the late morning sun. We raised money for 2 years to build this. Bake sales, church suppers, dances at the community center. Everyone contributed something because everyone had lost someone or knew someone who had. It wasn't just about the names on the stone. It was about remembering that some things are worth preserving. Jake followed her gaze to his father's name, etched among the others with careful precision. I never knew his name was there, he admitted. Most people don't look closely at memorials, Margaret said. They become part of the landscape after a while, background scenery. But every name represents someone's child, someone's husband, someone's father who didn't come home. Elena Rodriguez had been listening to the various conversations while coordinating the final restoration work with her Marines. The complexity of what was unfolding, teenage anger meeting military discipline, family dysfunction intersecting with community healing, required more than military solutions. She approached the group with the measured authority of someone used to bringing order to chaos. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying enough command presence to draw everyone's attention. All of us, about what happens next. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows around the memorial as the unlikely gathering of Marines, teenagers, veterans, and civilians prepared to confront the harder questions about justice, forgiveness, and what it truly meant to honor sacrifice. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows around the memorial as the unlikely gathering of Marines, teenagers, veterans, and civilians prepared to confront the harder questions about justice, forgiveness, and what it truly meant to honor sacrifice. Over the next 3 days, something unexpected began to happen in Millbrook. What had started as a community crisis evolved into something more complex, individual connections that transcended the original conflict between vandals and veterans. Jake found himself returning to the memorial each evening, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't fully explain. On Tuesday night, Elena Rodriguez was waiting for him again, this time with a worn photograph and a manila folder thick with military records. "These are your father's service records," she said, settling beside him. "On the memorial bench. Not the official ones they gave your mother. The real ones. The stories the other Marines told about him." Jake accepted the folder with trembling hands. Inside were handwritten accounts, photographs from Afghanistan, commendation letters that painted a picture of a man Jake had never really known. David Morrison emerged from these pages not as the distant father who'd abandoned his family, but as someone who'd carried photos of his son everywhere, who'd talked constantly about Jake's soccer games and science fair projects, who died protecting people he considered family. "He used to say you were going to be an engineer," Rodriguez said, watching Jake study a photo of his father in full combat gear, grinning at the camera. "Said you could build anything out of Legos, that you had the kind of mind that saw how things fit together." Jake's voice came out rough. "I haven't built anything in years. Maybe it's time to start again." Meanwhile, Tommy Chen was discovering that Lieutenant Park understood the weight of expectations that came with being a first-generation American. Their conversations had evolved from awkward small talk to genuine friendship as they worked together, documenting the stories behind each name on the memorial. "My parents want me to be a doctor," Tommy confided as they researched Staff Sergeant Michael Santos, killed in Vietnam at 19. "They sacrificed everything to get here, and they see medicine as security. But I love engineering. I want to build things, design systems that help people." Park nodded, understanding the familiar tension between family obligation and personal calling. "What kind of engineering?" "Civil engineering. Bridges, infrastructure, things that last. Tommy adjusted his glasses, warming to the subject. My grandfather used to tell me about the bridges they destroyed in Vietnam to slow down the North Vietnamese army. He said the saddest thing about war was watching people destroy the things that connected communities. So you want to build things that bring people together. Something like that. Tommy looked toward the memorial, where Marines continued their meticulous restoration work. Like this, I guess. Something that connects past and present, that helps people remember what matters. Park studied the young man's earnest face, recognizing something of his own younger self. You know, the Corps has engineering units, combat engineers, construction battalions. Might be worth looking into. The suggestion planted a seed in Tommy's mind. The first time he'd considered that military service might be a way of honoring his family's values rather than abandoning them. Casey's transformation was more reluctant, but no less profound. Frank. Kowalski had begun showing up at Morrison's hardware during her shifts, ostensibly to ask questions about restoration projects, but really to provide steady, non-judgmental presence. His own experience with anger and isolation had taught him the value of patience. You ever think about what you want to do after graduation? He asked one afternoon, examining paint samples with the careful attention of someone who had all the time in the world. Casey shrugged, rearranging inventory to avoid eye contact. Get out of here. Find a place where nobody knows my history. Running away doesn't change who you are, Frank said mildly. Trust me on that one. Easy for you to say. You've got a place here. People respect you. Frank laughed, but it sounded more sad than amused. Kid, I've been hiding from this community for 40 years. Only reason people respect me now is because I finally stopped running from my own ghosts. He showed her a faded photograph from his wallet, himself in jungle fatigues, 19 years old and grinning at the camera, surrounded by Marines who looked impossibly young. Most of these guys didn't make it home, he said quietly. I spent decades feeling guilty about that, angry at the world, pushing away anyone who tried to get close. Took me 40 years to figure out that isolating myself wasn't honoring their sacrifice. It was wasting the life they died protecting. Casey studied the photograph, seeing echoes of her own defensive anger in Frank's young face. What changed? Met a kid in foster care who reminded me of myself. Angry, scared, convinced the world was out to get him. Realized I could either keep wallowing in my own pain, or I could use my experience to help someone else avoid my mistakes. What happened to the kid? He's in college now. Engineering program. Sends me pictures of the bridges he's designing. Frank tucked the photograph back in his wallet. Turns out helping other people heal is the only way to heal yourself. The conversation planted something in Casey's mind. The radical notion that her difficult experiences might be valuable rather than shameful, that survival skills could become helping skills. Patricia Williams had been watching these developing relationships with the calculating eye of a politician and the conflicted heart of an estranged aunt. Her conversations with Casey remained stilted and careful, but she found herself genuinely moved by the changes she witnessed in her niece. I should have fought for custody when your mother died, she admitted during one awkward coffee shop meeting. I should have brought you home instead of letting you disappear into the system. Casey's walls remained partially raised, but there was less hostility in her voice. You had your career to think about. Foster kid with behavioral problems doesn't exactly fit the image of a successful politician. That's not fair to either of us, Patricia said. I was scared I wouldn't know how to help you, scared I'd make things worse. So I told myself you were better off with professionals. Were you right? Patricia looked at her niece, 18 years old, scarred by abandonment but showing signs of healing, beginning to trust that not everyone would leave. "No," she said simply. "I was wrong. But maybe it's not too late to be family now." Sarah Morrison had been watching her son's transformation with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Jake's anger was softening, but she recognized that healing would require confronting truths she'd spent 5 years avoiding. Elena Rodriguez visited her at work one afternoon, 2 cups of coffee and a gentle invitation to finally talk about the husband they'd both lost. "He loved you both so much," Rodriguez said, settling into the break. Room chair across from Sarah. "Talked about you constantly. Said you were the strongest person he'd ever met, that you could handle anything life threw at you." Sarah's composure cracked. "I wasn't strong enough to handle losing him." "Strength isn't about not breaking," Rodriguez said quietly. "It's about what you do after you break. You raised his son alone, worked multiple jobs, kept your family together. David would be so proud of what you've accomplished." For the first time in 5 years, Sarah began to believe that might be true. As Memorial Day weekend approached, the restoration work neared completion, but the real transformation was just beginning. The memorial gleamed in the afternoon sun, but more importantly, the people gathered around it were learning that healing wasn't about forgetting pain. It was about transforming it into something meaningful. As Memorial Day weekend approached, the restoration work neared completion, but the real transformation was just beginning. The memorial gleamed in the afternoon sun, but more importantly, the people gathered around it were learning that healing wasn't about forgetting pain. It was about transforming it into something meaningful. However, not everyone in Millbrook was ready to embrace this transformation. Jim Patterson, owner of Patterson's Auto Repair and a veteran of the Gulf War, had been watching the developing relationships between Marines and Vandals with growing irritation. On Wednesday evening, he stood before a hastily organized meeting of concerned citizens in the back room of Murphy's Tavern, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd served his country and paid his taxes for 30 years. "I want to know when we started rewarding criminal behavior with group therapy sessions," Patterson said, his weathered hands gripping the back of a chair. "These kids vandalized our memorial, and instead of consequences, they're getting private tutoring from the Marine Corps." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. About 20 people had shown up, mostly older residents who remembered when community problems were solved with clear consequences rather than complicated conversations about healing and understanding. "My nephew got caught with spray paint 2 years ago," added Helen Morrison, no relation to Jake despite the shared surname. "Had to do community service, pay restitution, and he still can't get into the college program he wanted. These 3 destroy a war memorial and get adopted by Marines. Where's the justice in that?" Earl Williams, a Vietnam veteran who'd served 2 tours before coming home to work at the paper mill, stood slowly. His arthritis made movement painful, but his voice carried clear across the room. "I lost 3 friends in that war," he said, his tone measured but hard. "Came home to people spitting on my uniform, calling me a baby killer. Took 30 years before anyone thanked me for my service. Now we're supposed to feel sorry for kids who think honoring the dead is a joke." The sentiment resonated through the group. These were people who'd carried their own wounds for decades, who'd received little sympathy or understanding for their sacrifices. Watching teenagers receive compassion and mentorship for acts of destruction felt like salt in old wounds. Patterson pulled out his phone, showing the screen to the group. "I've been tracking this on social media. They're calling it restorative justice and community healing. Makes me sick. We've got Marine units driving up from North Carolina to clean up after local delinquents, while the kids who did the damage get treated like victims." What Patterson didn't mention What he couldn't quite articulate even to himself was that watching Jake Morrison find connection with Marines who'd served with his father triggered his own unprocessed grief. Patterson had lost his squad. Leader in Iraq had carried survivor's guilt for 15 years and had never found anyone who understood that particular weight. Meanwhile, social media was amplifying the division. Millbrook Memorial had become a trending hashtag, with people across the country weighing in on the situation. Conservative voices condemned what they saw as coddling criminals, while progressive voices praised the community's approach to restorative rather than punitive justice. The attention was making life difficult for everyone involved. Tommy's parents, Dr. James and Linda Chen, found themselves fielding calls from other families in the Asian American community who worried about their children's association with criminal elements. "Tommy's a good boy," Linda Chen said during a tense conversation with the Lees, whose daughter was in Tommy's AP physics class. "He made a mistake, but he's learning from it." "Learning what?" asked Margaret Lee, her voice sharp with concern. "That actions don't have consequences? That destroying public property gets you special attention from the military?" The social pressure was taking its toll on Tommy, who found himself caught between his growing friendship with Lieutenant Park and his parents' need to maintain face within their community. His grades, typically perfect, began to slip as he struggled to concentrate on calculus while processing complex questions about loyalty, honor, and the price of doing right. At Millbrook High School, the situation was becoming equally complicated. Principal Roberts called Jake into his office Wednesday afternoon, his expression grave with administrative concern. "Jake, I'm getting pressure from the school board about your graduation status," Roberts said, shuffling papers that documented Jake's disciplinary record. "Some members feel that someone who vandalized a war memorial shouldn't be allowed to participate in commencement ceremonies." Jake felt his stomach drop. Graduation was 2 weeks away, the culmination of 12 years of education and his ticket to the community college program he'd finally decided to pursue, engineering, inspired by his conversations with Lieutenant Park and Tommy. "But I haven't been convicted of anything yet," Jake protested, "and I'm trying to make things right." "I know that," Roberts said, his voice carrying genuine sympathy. "I've seen the changes in you these past few days, but some people see your involvement with the Marines as getting special treatment rather than facing real consequences." The pressure was affecting Casey even more directly. Her supervisor at Morrison's Hardware had received several complaints from customers who didn't want to be served by one of those kids who vandalized the memorial. Her hours had been cut, ostensibly due to slow sales, but Casey recognized the real reason. Worse, her high school guidance counselor had called her in for a meeting about her graduation status and college applications. "Casey, I have to be honest with you," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice carefully neutral. "The vandalism charges are going to affect your options. Several community colleges have already withdrawn their acceptance offers." Casey's face remained impassive, but inside she felt the familiar walls slamming back into place. She'd been starting to believe that Frank Kowalski's stories about redemption and second chances might apply to her, but reality was proving harsher than hope. The resistance reached a breaking point Thursday evening when Patterson organized a formal petition demanding that the Marines leave town and that the 3 vandals face traditional legal prosecution. Within 6 hours, he'd gathered over 200 signatures from community members who felt that mercy was being mistaken for justice. The petition made local news, creating a public confrontation that forced everyone to choose sides. Mayor Patricia Williams found herself caught between political necessity and personal conviction, knowing that her response would likely determine her political future. Elena Rodriguez received a call from her commanding officer at Camp Lejeune, Colonel Martinez, whose voice carried the weight of military hierarchy and institutional concern. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Martinez said, his tone carefully official, "I'm getting inquiries from higher up the chain about your unit's continued presence in Millbrook. Some people are questioning whether this falls within appropriate military activities. Dear sir, we're conducting a community service mission. You're conducting an unauthorized operation that's becoming a political issue," Martinez interrupted. "I need you to wrap this up and return to base by Friday evening." The order felt like a betrayal, not just of the work they'd been doing, but of David Morrison's memory and his son's healing process. Rodriguez found herself facing a choice between military obedience and personal conviction that would define not just her career, but the kind of Marine she wanted to be. As Thursday night settled over Millbrook, the community found itself divided along lines that had nothing to do with the original vandalism. The question was no longer what punishment the teenagers deserved, but what kind of community Millbrook wanted to be. One that embraced complexity and healing, or one that demanded simple justice and clear consequences. The approaching Memorial Day ceremony would force everyone to answer that question publicly, with the whole country watching. The approaching Memorial Day ceremony would force everyone to answer that question publicly, with the whole country watching. Friday morning brought the crisis to a head when Mayor Patricia Williams called an emergency town hall meeting for that evening, announcing it would determine the community's official response to both the vandalism and the Marines' presence. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock at Millbrook High School's auditorium, the only venue large enough to accommodate the expected crowd. By 6:30, the parking lot was full, with cars lining the surrounding streets and news vans from 3 regional stations setting up equipment outside. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with tension that felt electric and dangerous. Jim Patterson and his supporters occupied the left side of the room, their body language radiating righteous anger and determination. On the right side sat those who supported the reconciliation efforts, fewer in number, but no less committed to their position. Elena Rodriguez sat in the back row with Lieutenant Park and Corporal Torres, their dress blue uniforms making them impossible to ignore. She'd spent the morning in heated phone conversations with Colonel Martinez, ultimately choosing to ignore his direct order to return to base. Her military career was effectively over, but some principles mattered more than promotions. Jake Morrison entered the auditorium with his mother Sarah, both of them pale with the weight of community scrutiny. Tommy Chen sat with his parents, who looked uncomfortable but determined to support their son. Casey Williams came alone, having been told by her supervisor that her job at Morrison's Hardware would likely be terminated after the meeting, regardless of its outcome. Margaret Sullivan, despite her 83 years, occupied a front-row seat with the bearing of someone who'd earned the right to be heard. Frank Kowalski sat beside her, his normally gruff demeanor softened by the gravity of the moment. Mayor Patricia Williams called the meeting to order, her political instincts warring with genuine family concern as she looked out at the packed auditorium. "We're here tonight to address the situation surrounding the memorial vandalism and the subsequent response," she began, her voice carrying over the murmur of conversation. "This community needs to decide how we move forward." Jim Patterson was the first to speak, his prepared remarks carrying the weight of 30 years of community involvement and military service. "I respect what these Marines have done," he said, gesturing toward Rodriguez and her team. "But they've overstepped their bounds. We don't need outsiders coming in to solve our problems, and we sure don't need to reward criminal behavior with special treatment." He pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I've got police reports here showing that Jake Morrison has been in trouble before. Fighting at school, underage drinking, vandalism charges that were dropped when his mother couldn't afford legal representation. Tommy Chen was caught cheating on an exam last year. Casey Williams has a juvenile record going back to when she was 14. The revelations hit like bombs in the packed auditorium. Sarah Morrison's face went white as private. Family struggles became public ammunition. Tommy's parents looked stricken. The cheating incident had been a moment of panic during his father's brief unemployment, when Tommy feared disappointing parents who'd sacrificed everything for his education. Casey's response was immediate and defensive. She shot to her feet, her voice carrying across the room with raw anger. "So what?" she shouted, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "So we're not perfect. So we've made mistakes. Does that mean we don't deserve a chance to do better?" "It means you don't deserve special treatment," Patterson shot back. "It means facing consequences for your actions instead of getting adopted by the Marines." The exchange triggered something in Frank Kowalski, who rose slowly from his front row seat. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone who'd earned his opinions through decades of hard experience. "You want to talk about mistakes?" he said, his words cutting through the noise. "I made plenty. Came back from Vietnam angry at everyone and everything. Spent 40 years isolating myself because I was ashamed of what I'd seen and done." His voice began to shake, combat memories surfacing despite his efforts to contain them. "I watched good men die for nothing. I killed people who were just trying to protect their homes. I came back to a country that didn't want to hear about. It didn't want to deal with what we'd been through." The auditorium fell silent as Frank's composure began to crack, 40 years of suppressed trauma spilling out in front of the entire community. "I could have used someone like Sergeant Rodriguez. When I came home," he continued, his voice breaking, "someone who understood that anger is just grief, with nowhere to go. Someone who knew that punishment doesn't heal wounds, understanding does." Casey moved toward Frank, recognizing the signs of someone falling apart. She'd seen it countless times in foster care. Adults who'd reached their breaking point, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. "Frank," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "It's okay. You're okay." Her gesture, 18-year-old Casey Williams comforting a Vietnam veteran in the middle of his emotional breakdown, created a moment of silence that spoke louder than any argument about the possibility of redemption and the power of human connection. But the moment was shattered when someone from Patterson's section called out, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. These kids have got you all so twisted around that you can't see straight." The comment triggered an explosion of angry voices from both sides of the auditorium. People were on their feet, shouting over each other, years of community tensions and personal grievances spilling into the open. "Enough!" The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to Corporal Miguel Torres, who'd wheeled his chair to the center aisle. The sight of the disabled Marine demanding attention created immediate silence. "You want to know what honor looks like?" Torres said, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. "It's not about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after you make them." He gestured toward Jake, Tommy, and Casey. "These kids screwed up. They did something terrible, and they're going to live with that for the rest of their lives. But instead of doubling down on their mistake, they're trying to learn from it. They're trying to understand what they damaged and why it mattered." Torres's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I lost my legs in Iraq. Could have spent the rest of my life angry about that, feeling sorry for myself, blaming everyone else for my problems. Instead, I chose to find meaning in what happened to me. I chose to use my experience to help other people." He looked directly at Patterson. "You lost friends in Iraq. I can see it in your face. You know that particular kind of grief. You can either use that pain to build walls between yourself and these kids, or you can use it to help them understand what sacrifice really means." The challenge hung in the air as Elena Rodriguez stood, knowing that her next words would determine not just the outcome of this meeting, but the future of everyone involved. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice carrying military authority despite the chaos of the civilian setting, about Staff Sergeant David Morrison and what he would want for his son. The mention of Jake's father created immediate attention, the room falling silent as Rodriguez prepared to reveal information that would change everything once again. The mention of Jake's father created immediate attention, the room falling silent as Rodriguez prepared to reveal information that would change everything once again. Staff Sergeant David Morrison wrote letters, Rodriguez said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to share. Letters to his son that he never got to send, letters about what it means to serve, what it means to make mistakes, and what it means to find your way back from them. She reached into her dress uniform pocket and withdrew a worn envelope, yellowed with age and desert dust. He gave this to me 3 days before he died, said if anything happened to him, I should give it to Jake when he was old enough to understand. Rodriguez's eyes found Jake in the crowd. I think that time is now. Jake's mother, Sarah, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She'd never known about any letters, had never been given anything beyond the official notifications and David's personal effects. Jake, Rodriguez called, this is yours. The auditorium watched in absolute silence as Jake stood on trembling legs and walked down the aisle to accept the letter. His hands shook as he opened the envelope, unfolded the pages, and began to read silently. The silence stretched until Jake looked up, tears streaming down his face, and began to read aloud. Son, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home, and I'm sorrier about that than you'll ever know. I know you're angry with me. I know you think I chose this over you and your mom, and maybe part of that is true, but I need you to understand something about the choice I made. Jake's voice cracked, but he continued reading. I didn't join the Marines to leave you. I joined because I wanted to build a world where you'd never have to make the same choice, where you could grow up safe, where you could make mistakes and learn from them without someone trying to destroy everything you love. The words hit the auditorium like physical blows, the reality of a father's sacrifice becoming personal and immediate. You're going to screw up, Jake. You're 17 years old and angry and stubborn, just like I was. When you do screw up, and you will, remember that making mistakes doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human. What makes you a man is what you do after you screw up. Whether you let your mistakes define you or whether you use them to become someone better. Jake had to stop reading, overcome by emotions he'd suppressed for 5 years. Tommy Chen rose from his seat and walked to Jake's side, offering silent support. After a moment, Casey Williams did the same, the 3 vandals standing together, in front of their community. There's more, Jake said, his voice stronger now. He continued reading. I've made my share of mistakes, son. I've been angry. I've been scared. I've let my pride get in the way of doing what's right. But I've learned. The courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing the right thing, even when you're terrified. Jake looked up at the crowd, his father's words giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. The letter says, I should find a way to serve something bigger than myself, Jake said, his voice carrying new authority. That I should use whatever talents I have to build things, instead of tearing them down. He looked directly at Jim Patterson. Mr. Patterson, you're right. We don't deserve special treatment, but we're not asking for it. We're asking for a chance to earn forgiveness through service. Tommy stepped forward, his academic mind finally finding clarity about his own future. My parents came here with nothing because they believed America was a place where people could start over, where mistakes didn't have to be permanent. His voice grew stronger as he continued. Lieutenant Park has been teaching me about military engineering, about building infrastructure that brings communities together instead of dividing them. I want to serve. I want to earn the right to call myself an American. Casey's contribution was quieter but no less powerful. "I've been angry my whole life. Angry at parents who died. Angry at a system that moved me around like furniture. Angry at a world that seemed designed to hurt me." She looked at Frank Kowalski, who was still struggling with his own emotional breakdown. "But Frank taught me that anger is just grief with nowhere to go. Maybe it's time I found somewhere constructive for it to go." The three teenagers stood together, no longer the defiant vandals who destroyed community property, but young people taking responsibility for their actions and their futures. Sarah Morrison rose from her seat, her voice carrying across the auditorium. "5 years ago, I got the worst news a military wife can receive. I was so angry, so broken, that I couldn't even talk to my son about his father. I let my grief become his anger, and I'm sorry for that." She looked at Elena Rodriguez with profound gratitude. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you've given me back my husband's memory and my son's future. Whatever the community decides about consequences, our family will never forget what you've done." Mayor Patricia Williams recognized the shift in the room's emotional temperature. The anger and division that had defined the evening was giving way to something more complex: understanding, empathy, and the possibility of healing. "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to reconsider what justice looks like in this situation." Jim Patterson stood slowly, his opposition visibly wavering as he processed what he'd witnessed. The letter from David Morrison had hit him particularly hard, reminding him of his own squad leader's sacrifice and his own unprocessed grief. "I lost my sergeant in Iraq," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the auditorium. "He was 24 years old, married, had a baby daughter he never got to meet." Patterson's composure cracked slightly. "I've been angry about that for 15 years, angry at everyone and everything." He looked at Jake, Tommy, and Casey with new understanding. "Maybe I've been looking for someone to blame instead of looking for a way to honor what he died protecting." Margaret Sullivan rose from her front row seat, her 83 years giving her words the authority of witnessed history. "This memorial wasn't built for punishment," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It was built for remembrance, for teaching, for connecting past and future. If these young people want to spend their futures honoring what they once dishonored, then we should give them that chance." Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, knowing that her next words would determine whether the sacrifice of her military career had been worthwhile. "Colonel Martinez has ordered me back to Camp Lejeune," she announced. "I'm probably facing a court-martial for disobeying direct orders, but some things matter more than careers, and some lessons can only be taught through example." She looked at Jake, Tommy, and Casey with the expression of someone who'd found her true mission. "If this community will have us, my Marines and I would like to stay through Memorial Day. Not as outsiders fixing your problems, but as Americans helping. Americans remember what service really means." The auditorium erupted in applause, the sound building until it filled every corner of the space. The crisis had passed, transformed into something that looked very much like hope. Tomorrow would bring Memorial Day, and with it a ceremony that would honor not just those who had died for their country, but those who had chosen to live for it. Tomorrow would bring Memorial Day, and with it a ceremony that would honor not just those who had died for their country, but those who had chosen to live for it. Memorial Day morning dawned clear and bright over Millbrook, the kind of perfect May Day that made small coastal towns look like postcards. By 8 o'clock, Veterans Park was already bustling with activity as Marines, veterans, and community volunteers worked together to prepare for a ceremony that had evolved far beyond its original scope. Jake Morrison arrived early, wearing the dress shirt and tie his mother had insisted upon, carrying a speech he'd written and rewritten a dozen times during the sleepless hours before dawn. The memorial stood gleaming in the morning sun, its restored surface reflecting the American flags that had been placed around its perimeter. But more importantly, it reflected the faces of people who had gathered not in division, but in shared purpose. Elena Rodriguez approached him, her dress blues immaculate, despite the fact that she was technically AWOL and facing court-martial proceedings that could end her career. "You ready for this?" she asked, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read Marines under stress. "I think so," Jake replied, then shook his head. "No, that's not true. I'm terrified. But my dad's letter said courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified," Rodriguez finished, smiling at the echo of David Morrison's words. "He'd be proud of you, Jake." Tommy Chen had arrived with his parents, who had surprised the Asian American community by publicly supporting their son's decision to enlist in the Marines after graduation. Lieutenant Park stood beside them, no longer just a mentor, but a friend who had helped Tommy understand that service could be a form of honor rather than abandonment. "My grandmother wants to meet you," Tommy said to Park, gesturing toward an elderly woman who stood with quiet dignity beside Dr. and Mrs. Chen. "She says she wants to thank you for helping her grandson understand what her husband died protecting." Park approached the elderly woman with the respect due to someone who had survived war and displacement. She spoke to him in halting English, her words carrying the weight of decades of gratitude for the American soldiers who had helped her family escape Vietnam. Casey Williams had arrived alone, as expected, but Margaret Sullivan immediately took her under wing, introducing her to other community members as one of our young people who's found her calling in service. The phrase would have made Casey cringe a week ago, but now it felt like a description of possibility rather than judgment. Frank Kowalski stood beside Casey, his emotional breakdown from the town hall meeting having created an unexpected bond between them. He'd spent the weekend sharing stories of his own struggle with post-war adjustment, helping Casey understand that healing was possible even after decades of isolation. "You remind me of myself at your age," he told her quietly. "Angry at the world, convinced that everyone was going to leave eventually, so why bother getting attached?" "What changed?" Casey asked, genuinely curious about the man who had become an unlikely father figure. "You did," Frank replied simply. "Watching you choose compassion over anger, watching you care for me when I was falling apart, it reminded me that we're all just broken people trying to help each other heal." Mayor Patricia Williams served as master of ceremonies, her political instincts finally aligned with her personal values. The morning's program began traditionally with the posting of colors and the national anthem performed by the high school choir, but then it evolved into something unprecedented in Millbrook's history. Margaret Sullivan spoke first, her voice carrying 83 years of witnessed history as she shared the story of the memorial's construction and the community sacrifice it represented. She introduced each section of names, explaining the conflicts they represented and the families they'd left behind. "This memorial was never about perfection," she said, her sharp eyes scanning the gathered crowd. "It was about remembrance, about learning, about understanding that freedom requires constant tending by each new generation." Frank Kowalski followed her to the podium, his first public appearance at a Memorial Day ceremony since returning from Vietnam 40 years earlier. His speech was brief but powerful, focusing on the importance of communities that helped their wounded heal rather than casting them aside. "I spent 40 years in exile from this community because I was ashamed of what war had done to me," he said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. "These young people have taught me that healing happens when we choose connection over isolation, when we choose service over self-pity." Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Jake Morrison approached the podium, his father's letter, folded in his pocket, his prepared speech forgotten as he spoke from the heart. "A week ago, I spray-painted this memorial because I was angry," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the park. "Angry at my father for dying, angry at the world for not caring, angry at myself for not understanding what his sacrifice meant." He gestured toward the Marines who stood at attention beside the memorial. "These Marines didn't come here to punish us. They came to show us what honor looks like when it responds to dishonor. They came to teach us that the best way to honor the dead is to serve the living." Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued. "My father wrote me a letter before he died. He said I would make mistakes, and that making mistakes wouldn't make me a failure. It would make me human. What would make me a man was what I did after I made mistakes." He looked directly at Jim Patterson, who sat in the front row with tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Patterson, you were right to be angry with us. We dishonored something sacred, but you were also right about something else. Consequences matter. So here are our consequences. Tommy Chen is enlisting in the Marines to serve as a combat engineer. Casey Williams is starting college in the fall to study social work, specializing in helping kids in foster care. And I'm going to study engineering so I can build things that bring communities together instead of tearing them apart." The applause that followed was not polite ceremony appreciation, but genuine community celebration of transformation witnessed and healing achieved. Casey stepped forward to speak about finding family in unexpected places, about learning that anger could become compassion with the right guidance. Tommy presented the research project he and Lieutenant Park had completed, documenting the story behind every name on the memorial and creating a permanent record that would help future generations understand the cost of freedom. Elena Rodriguez was the final speaker, and her words carried the weight of a military career potentially sacrificed for principle. "6 days ago, I came here expecting to clean up some graffiti and go home," she said, her command presence filling the park. "Instead, I found something more valuable than any career. I found the true meaning of the oath I took 15 years ago to support and defend the Constitution of the United States." She gestured toward Jake, Tommy, and Casey. "These young people have reminded me that the Constitution isn't just about laws and government. It's about the promise that people can change, that communities can heal, that justice and mercy can coexist." The ceremony concluded with the traditional laying of wreaths. But this year, the 3 former Vandals participated, placing flowers beside the names of the fallen, while Marines stood at attention in honor guard formation. As the formal ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, small groups remained in the park, veterans sharing stories with teenagers, Marines explaining military customs to curious civilians, families learning about relatives whose names they'd never really noticed. On the memorial, Jake Morrison stood beside his father's name, no longer ashamed of the legacy he'd inherited, but determined to prove worthy of it. The spray paint was gone, but the lessons learned in its removal would last a lifetime. The memorial stood restored, but more importantly, so did the community that surrounded it. Memorial Day 2025 in Millbrook, Massachusetts would be remembered not for the vandalism that started it all, but for the healing that followed. Proof that honor could be restored, that communities could choose grace over judgment, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons came not from punishment, but from understanding the weight of what had been damaged and the joy of making it whole again. In the distance, church bells chimed 11 o'clock, their sound carrying across the harbor and out to sea, where David Morrison and all the others rested in peace, knowing their sacrifice had not been forgotten, and their legacy lived on in the hands of those who chose to serve something larger than themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.